Hi there, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of our webinar series. This month, we're going to be talking about a trauma-informed response to sexual assault. But first, before we get started, we are just going to give a warning that some of the content you're about to hear might be upsetting for some folks, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause if you need to. And also, we'd like to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory, and we also operate on Treaty 1 territory. And these are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and is also the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. So before we get started, I'm just going to go over a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to go over what trauma is, how it can be defined. We're going to go over what a trauma-informed response would be defined as, what it constitutes, some examples of how it would look, and then we're going to talk about why it's relevant in cases of sexual assault. And finally, we're going to discuss just briefly where a trauma-informed response to sexual assault could be useful in service provision for survivors of sexual assault. I'm also going to give you some resources for further learning, and as always, our contact page will be at the end. So what is trauma? I think trauma is generally misunderstood. So psychologist Tara Brach defines trauma as when we have encountered an out-of-control frightening experience that has disconnected us from all sense of resourcefulness or safety or coping or love. So trauma is not necessarily the events that are thought of as traumatic, although they certainly can be. So generally things that we tend to think of as traumatic events would be things like surviving a natural disaster, so like a hurricane or a wildfire or a flood, being in a car accident or losing somebody close to you. These are all things that we generally think of when we think of what is a traumatic event. And they certainly are, as they do disconnect us from all sense of resourcefulness or safety or coping or love, as the psychologist defines. But there are also a lot of traumatic events that we don't necessarily think of when we think of what a traumatic event is. So something that could be a traumatic event is losing your job. Childhood neglect could be a form of trauma. Losing your home could be a form of trauma, whether that's through eviction or some kind of destruction. So it's really important that we understand that trauma is not necessarily the event itself, but what our brains make of it. So if an event results in somebody feeling out of control, like they couldn't stop the event from happening, then that might result in trauma being experienced and somebody experiencing a trauma response. Klinic Community Health in Winnipeg has an excellent resource for learning more about trauma, trauma-informed response, different types of trauma. It's called the Trauma-Informed Toolkit, and in it they define 3 conditions that are met in all situations that could be deemed traumatic. So the event must be unexpected, the person must have been unprepared for the event, and there was nothing the person could do to stop it from happening. So when all 3 of those conditions are met, regardless of what the event is, it's something that could be considered a trauma. So in the previous example of somebody losing their home, if that was unexpected, if the person was unprepared for it and there was nothing they could do from stopping it, so for example, like a house fire, then that could be a traumatic event. And a house fire, for example, is something that would be traumatic for some people, but not for all people, because again, trauma is not necessarily the event itself, but rather what our brains make of it. So in the other example of things that you tend to associate with trauma, so being in a car accident is something that people would associate with a traumatic event. And for a lot of people, it is a very traumatic event, but for some folks who have been in a car accident, their brains don't view it that way, so the event was not traumatic for them, even though for a lot of other people it would be. So I just can't reiterate enough that trauma is not necessarily the event itself, but how our brains integrate that information, process it, and store it. And everybody processes trauma or potentially traumatic situations differently. While one person may experience trauma as a result of a particular event, another person who experienced the exact same event might not. So what affects how or whether somebody experiences trauma? What makes an event traumatic to some but not to others? There are a lot of factors, and I think we don't fully understand all of the factors that affect whether or not somebody experiences an event as traumatic. But some of the ones that we do know have an effect are age, history, so including your family history, your life history, whether they've experienced trauma before. It's actually been found that folks who have experienced trauma before are sometimes better able to process traumatic events and have different experiences of trauma after the initial. The presence of intergenerational trauma can affect whether or not somebody experiences trauma in the future. Access and availability of supports. And I differentiate between access and availability because, yes, it's important that people have access to supports, that supports exist, but if they're just available and not accessible, then that's a problem, right? So if there are, for example, counseling services available, but there's a high cost to those counseling services, then yes, they're available, but they're not accessible to everybody. And finally, the response of people close to them after the event can have a really strong impact on whether or how somebody experiences trauma. So if somebody experiences, for example, the house fire example that we talked about before, and the person who experienced it is experiencing it as a trauma, but the people around them are telling them, oh, you can just get another house, or it's not a big deal, so these things happen. That's a really negative response that would affect the person's experience of the trauma and could actually make it worse. But if the person who experienced the house fire is met with a response that, we're so sorry this happened to you, how can we support you, offering resources, that could go a long way to lessening the trauma that somebody could experience from an event like a house fire. So again, trauma is not what happened, it's what our brain makes of what has happened and how events that are potentially traumatic or traumatic are processed, stored, and ultimately how we make sense of them. Trauma doesn't necessarily diminish over time, and for many, the feelings caused by trauma can intensify. So for some people, if they have access to counseling, for example, they may be able to start to work through the trauma, and the effects of that trauma could lessen over time. But for many, people don't have access to things like counseling or other supports, and so the trauma caused by unresolved trauma, the feeling, caused by unresolved trauma can actually intensify over time. So trauma can lead to a lot of things. It can lead to feelings of helplessness, despondency, anxiety, depression, guilt, or shame. And I'll also note that although PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is commonly associated with trauma, not everybody who experiences trauma acquires diagnosable PTSD. Many do, but many also don't. So while it's a possibility, it's not necessarily a given. And it's also good to note that there are different types of trauma. So there's interpersonal trauma, so trauma that we experience between ourselves and other people. Intergenerational trauma, so trauma that occurs between generations. External trauma, so trauma that doesn't have anything to do necessarily with other people. So for example, like that natural disaster kind of idea. And developmental trauma, so trauma that occurs in childhood and affects developmental capabilities of the brain and other nervous system structures. So what's a trauma-informed response then? If we know what trauma is and how it works in the brain, what is a trauma-informed response? So a trauma-informed response is essentially just recognizing how trauma works, understanding what can cause trauma, and re-traumatization. And re-traumatization is becoming traumatized again after the initial event. A trauma-informed response is also working to ensure that services and programs are delivered in a way that minimizes the possibility for harm. So when someone has experienced trauma, we want to make sure that the services and programs that we're offering and delivering are done in a way that minimizes the harm that the person could experience in accessing those services and programs. It's also about understanding the effects of trauma on behavior and mental state. So going back to that other slide, going back to the effects that trauma can have and how it can affect people's mental health and their behaviors. And there are a certain number of qualities that are needed when working with people who have experienced trauma. So empathy, being able to understand the emotions that somebody else is feeling. Compassion is really important to make sure people feel like you're with them, that you support them. Understanding and openness, just really listening to people and trying to understand where they're coming from, kind of no topic off limits kind of thing. Taking a non-judgmental approach is critical in terms of a trauma-informed response. So not making any judgments on how somebody feels or how they're processing the trauma. Self-awareness, so that's awareness of ourselves as service providers, just being aware of our body language and the language that the actual language that we're using to make sure that we're minimizing the possibility for harm. A willingness to listen. Sometimes people who have experienced trauma feel that they're not being listened to, especially if they've experienced a type of trauma that is not necessarily viewed as trauma. They may feel that they aren't being listened to, that they're not being heard. So for service providers who are assisting folks who have experienced trauma, that willingness to listen is critical also. And the ability to prevent dysregulation in oneself is critical. If somebody is speaking to you about the trauma they've experienced and you start getting upset or worked up, then that's going to also dysregulate the other person as well, which could make them more upset or agitated. So really just making sure that we're able to remain calm and kind of cool and prevent dysregulation in ourselves so that we don't accidentally transfer that over to the other person. Trauma-informed responses are also what we like to call strengths-based, which is guiding conversations towards the strengths that somebody already has. So for example, staying away from language that suggests deficiencies. So using or saying, what happened to you, or asking what happened to you instead of asking what's wrong with you. So acknowledging that something has happened to them that's outside of their control and that they're doing their best to remedy it guides the conversation towards the strengths that somebody already has. People who have experienced trauma may already feel guilt or shame, weakness, or low self-esteem. So it's best to try to counter that in a positive way wherever possible and highlight the good work that they've already done to remedy their trauma, the strengths that they have in working to overcome it, all those kinds of things. A trauma-informed response is also survivor-centered, which is something that's centered around meeting somebody where they're at, taking the time to talk to them and understand their story, where they're coming from. It's not trying to sway them one way or the other in terms of treatment or support or activities. It's respecting their choices and emphasizing that they do have choices and that their consent is required to move forward in whatever treatment or resource path that they choose, and empowering them, again, to make those choices rather than forcing them upon somebody saying that you need to do this, this, and this in order to work through your trauma. It's talking about somebody to see, what they might need, what they might respond best to. Maybe they're opposed to certain kinds of treatment, or they have tried it in the past and it hasn't worked for them. So really just meeting them where they're at, recognizing that they are a human being with human rights and helping them to realize those rights in whatever way that you can. So service providers taking a trauma-informed approach also should be taking a trauma-informed approach to themselves outside of work. I think it goes without saying that working in situations where trauma is present can be really hard. And in some service providers, it can trigger traumatic memories or sensations in themselves, and they might not recognize that until they're actually in the moment. So yeah, just making sure that we're engaging in self-care, checking in with ourselves often, saying, how do I really feel about that? Just sitting with ourselves, and making sure that we're okay. Having a network of support around us, whether that's colleagues or family or friends that kind of get what the job is and understand how to support you the best. And being open with your colleagues and engaging in debriefs where possible can be really important for just making sure that everybody's okay, everybody's on the same page. And if anybody needs anything at all, that there's a team around them that can work to get those resources that they need. So why is a trauma-informed response to sexual assault relevant? And you might be thinking, well, of course it's relevant. Sexual assault is traumatic. And as service providers, we know that it is traumatic. But unfortunately, many times sexual assault and sexual violence are not seen as traumatic by the general public. And one of the reasons this might be is because of how varied people's experiences of sexual violence are. So sexual assault is defined as any sexual activity, behavior, contact, or touching that makes you uncomfortable and or that you did not consent to. So being pressured, manipulated, coerced, or threatened into engaging in unwanted sexual activity or contact, being able to give consent to the sexual activity because they were asleep, unconscious, or intoxicated, forced kissing, fondling, oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse. So unfortunately, some people try to define what should and should not be traumatic to others. So I'll give you an example. So let's say a sexual assault occurred, that, let's say it happened at a party, the survivor was unconscious or intoxicated, and when they come to, they realize that they have been sexually assaulted. Unfortunately, you hear a lot of times in the press about cases like that, in kind of just like general discourse, that, well, she doesn't remember anyway, or, she didn't move or didn't try to stop it. And that goes back to the fight, flight, or freeze response that we talked about in the neurobiology of trauma episode. But essentially, when somebody's been sexually assaulted, sometimes people try to define what should and should not be traumatic for others. So if a sexual assault was a penetrative sexual assault versus a non-penetrative sexual assault, sometimes the non-penetrative sexual assault is seen as less serious or not traumatic, when in fact it is very much traumatic, regardless of whether the assault was penetrative or not. So a trauma-informed approach is necessary in any situation where trauma might be present, because again, trauma is not the event itself, it's what the brain makes of it. And it's not up to anybody else but the survivor to determine if that assault that they experienced was traumatic or how traumatic it was to them. That's up to them to share that, and not for anybody else to try to decide it for them. So where could a trauma-informed response to sexual assault be useful in service provision? And I think ideally in any area of society that works directly with survivors of sexual assault, there would be a trauma-informed response present. So in healthcare providers, that would be emergency department staff, specialized medical professionals, so SANEs or sexual assault nurse examiners, OBGYNs, all those kinds of things, and primary care physicians. Ideally, all of those folks would be using a trauma-informed response to sexual assault. In the justice system, that would include police, crowns, defense attorneys, judges, JJPs or judicial justices of the peace, corrections officers. In community-based organizations, that would be shelters, food banks, employment support agencies, just nonprofits in general. Ideally, all of those actors would be aware of what a trauma-informed response to sexual assault looks like and how to partake in one. And just for the general public, I think it's really important to know about what a trauma-informed response is, how it's applicable to sexual assault, and kind of how to engage in a trauma-informed process, because there are so many folks who have experienced sexual assault and sexual violence that it's very possible that somebody you know has experienced that. And even if you're not a service provider, it's good to know how to support the folks that you know who are in your life who may have experienced sexual assault or sexual violence. So let's talk about some further resources. For this presentation, one of the resources I used was Klinic's Trauma-Informed Toolkit, and also Dr. Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal. I also drew on Government of Canada reports. There was a literature review compiled by professors from University of British Columbia. There are many resources available online and through academic journals, but also Dr. Renee Linklater's book, Decolonizing Trauma Work, was excellent for taking a decolonial approach to trauma-informed responses and how trauma-informed responses with regards to Indigenous women and girls who have experienced sexual assault and sexual violence can be bettered. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, is all about trauma and how it manifests in the body. And Dr. Bruce Perry's book with Oprah Winfrey is called What Happened to You? And it's also about kind of changing the language around trauma and making a trauma-informed society. So these are all really good resources that would probably be available at your local library. Klinic is available online. And there are also a ton of good resources on trauma and trauma-informed responses on Google and Google Scholar through various credible organizations that would be good to look at as well. So that's what we've got for you today. As always, feel free to contact us with any questions or comments or concerns. Our information is here, and we would do our best to assist you in whatever you might need. Thanks, and we'll see you next month.